TCC is back for its third event of Season 3, bringing in a ton of newcomers as long as active players, all to support a very great cause. However, only some teams will be able to reach for the stars, while others fall short. And today, I will be reviewing the TCC Reach for the Stars team. First up, we have the Red Rabbits with Sea Dog, No No Money, Salt Content, and Rory Animates. This team is the only full newcomer team in this event, which could put them at a slight disadvantage, but I highly doubt that. First up, we have Sea Dog, who is an all-rounder, meaning jack of all trades, master of none. However, that also means he's not weak at any games, so that makes him a very flexible player. We also have Salt, who is a person who excels more in movement games like hole in the one than tug toss, but still he isn't that bad at like PvP in general. And then we have Rory, who also tries more in the movement games like TG and parkour. And then lastly, we have No No Money, who I don't really know that well, their skill level. Although I do know they can place like a wide variety of places. So they're a real wild card for this event. Now, I think this team is definitely going to want to avoid PvP games late, as they're not the worst. They certainly aren't the strongest PvP team either. And there are definitely more scarier teams out there for PvP. However, if they get tug toss and like hole in the wall late, I think this team can like easily dominate at the end and catch everyone's surprise. But I think they're gonna have like good enough comms to like get them through the PvP games as well. So I think they stand like a decent chance. Next up, we have the Yellow Yaks with Axel VA, Cheetahs, MCCI Foxy, and Zombie. Now, this is a very interesting team as it sees the return of the infamous duo Cheetahs and Foxies, and also the return of Zombie, who has not played since TCC Charity Challenge. Now, obviously, Foxy and Cheetahs is just like very strong duo. Honestly, not the strongest duo we've ever seen in TCC, but is definitely up there in terms of like stats. Cheetahs is a strong PvP player. However, I would not sleep on him in some of the movement games like RSR, as he can do pretty well in them. And then we have Foxy, who's just like all around like pretty good at the game. They don't really have like a super strong game or weak game. They're just like generally good at like everything. And then we have Zombie, who didn't do the best the first time she played in TCC, although I do think this team is stronger than the one she had there, as that team was wildly unbalanced. I think she's a bit more rounded toward PvP than movement, although I could be wrong. And then we have Axel, who I don't know too much about generally, so I don't really have like a good read on what they're good at per se. So for me, they're a bit of a wild card. I think this team is gonna want to play PvP games a bit more later, and maybe RSR. I think generally they'll be okay in movement with Cheetahs and Foxy, but I think the other two are gonna struggle a bit more in terms of that. And I think this team can like easily dominate like PvP with the like right leadership, and I think they're gonna definitely have good cons with Cheetahs and Foxy. Next up, we have the Green Geckos with GG Gamer, Glitch, Simple Falcon, and That Dark Phoenix. Now, this team features 3 newcomers, which is almost full team of newcomers, but obviously not. We have Gigi, who is actually pretty good at the game. While very inconsistent, is a very like strong all-around player who has no weaknesses but no strengths at the same time. Although if I had to pick, I'd say PvP is like more of his strong suit. Then we have Glitch, who tends to be a bit of a wild card in TCC, as he can either do really well or really bad. He tends to lean a bit more towards the movement games, like hole in the wall. Then we have that Dark Phoenix, who I don't have like a great idea on what games they're like generally good at. Although I do think they're a bit more like stronger towards movement games than PvP. And then we have Simple Falcon, who I don't really know much about, other than the fact that they're like actually really good at the game. So there's that. But yeah, as far as what this team is gonna be good at, I think it's kind of hard to tell. I feel like they're like generally all rounded, meaning they don't have a strong game or a weak game. And with GG's inconsistency, it could make this team a bit of a wild card in terms of how good they'll do. Although I still think, even with that, they can still do pretty well. Next up, we have the Cyan Coyotes with Andrea Ye, a purple penguin, General Alex, and Kuva Babylon. Now, I think this is a very interesting team, as this team depends really on like how good they all like perform, like generally. We got Kuva, who's a very like strong like movement player and decent PvPer. And then we have Andrea, who's a strong like movement player altogether, but can do very good in PvP in the right circumstances. Then we have Penguin, who's like generally a bit more of an all-rounder, besides being like particularly strong and hole in the wall. And then we have Alex, who is also like generally a bit more well-rounded in terms of games. Now, I think this team really depends on how well Penguin will do, and lesser to an extent, Kuba. Penguin has been on a roll recently, getting back-to-back second place. However, he is also one of the most inconsistent players out there, which can really like hurt this team like overall. And then obviously we have Kuba, who's had like some weak events, although generally he still does like very fine. I think this team is gonna want to play movement games like hole in the wall and like parkour late, as they have three really strong like movement players like generally, and then I think they can hold their own fairly well in PvP given the right circumstances. So I think this team could like easily dominate everyone else given the right game order and such. As long as Penguin keeps up his consistency of how he's been playing, I think this team has an easy shot to the finale if everything goes right. Next up, we have the Aqua Axolotls with Asots, Ichako, Igerts, and Spare. Now, this sees the return of the iconic duo, Spare and Asots, along with them being joined by Gertz and Chaco. Now, Gertz is like a generally like strong, like varied player. I'm gonna say, as they're stronger in like games like Hole in the Wall and TG, while still being decent at Battle Box. And then we have Chaco, who leans a bit more towards like PvP games like Battle Box and Sky Battle, but can still do like very well in movement games. And then we have Asots, who's a bit like stronger towards PvP, more specifically Battle Box. And then we have Spared, who's also more PvP orientated, although a bit more towards both than one or the other. No, I think this team is definitely going to want PvP late, as Spared and Asots are not commonly known for doing good at movement games. They tend to struggle way more at them than PvP. And, well, to a lesser extent, that also goes for Chaco. I think if they're able to get PvP games out like really late, they like can easily dominate, as I feel they're probably the strongest like PvP team out there. However, if they get like movement late, it's gonna be a lot rougher, especially RSR, as Spirit and Asots struggle in those like a lot more than any of the other movement games, particularly, even though they're still not like strong in them. So I think this team is very PvP forward, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. So who knows? Next up, we have the Blue Bats with It's Cosmo, Just Gills, Codex, and Rat King Gaming. This team is a bit of a mix of all trades. We've got Kills, who is a pretty solid all rounder, although tends to lean a bit more towards the PvP games like Sky Battle. And then we have Codex, who's more of a movement based player in games like RSR and Parkour Warrior. And then you have Cosmo, who again is a bit more well rounded. And then Rat King, who I don't know how good they are, or not how good they are, what games they're good at. Although I'll say they're generally more well rounded, as they are pretty much decent at everything, if not good. Now, with that being said, I think that makes this team very interesting, as they don't have really a super strong game in my opinion, except maybe Sky Battle. But they also don't have any too crazy weak games. Although I do think there's a few games that they'll struggle with maybe a bit more, but overall I think they have just a solid chance overall, due to not being too crazy weak at any games. And I definitely think they could sneak up from behind and surprise people. Next up, we have the Purple Pandas with King Coolio, Mr. Froz, Onid, and Rai 2I. Now, this team is a bit interesting. We got Rai 2I, who is a very strong movement player, overall. And then we have Caden, who again is another strong movement player, more so in games like RSR. However, he's still decent at PvP in fairness. And then we have Onid, another more movement oriented player towards RSR and Hole in the Wall. And then we have Mr. Proz, who's a bit more all rounded. I think this team's gonna struggle a bit more in PvP, as while they don't have any bad PvPers per se, they don't have any super strong ones, which could hurt them in games like BattleBox, where without a strong leader, it could cause them to struggle a bit more. However, their movement games are really strong. I think this is probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, RSR teams in the event, and probably one of the strongest hole in the wall teams as well. So I think if they can get those movement games out later, I think they still have a really good shot of making finale. And last, but certainly not least, we had the Pink Parrots with Bears cancelled, Dracoby, Fufov, and Trolliant. This team sees the return of Trolliant since ITCC, which was almost a year ago, which is crazy. And of course, we also see Bear playing TCC for the first time. Now, I think this team is kind of really mixed in a way. You got Trolliant, who's just super crazy at everything. Bro's goated. I don't think he's that crazy bad at any game. Then we have Draco, who's been on the training arc recently, which is definitely going to help this team out a lot. He is generally more geared towards PvP games like BattleBox and Sky Battle, while still being relatively decent at the movement games, although he can be a little bit inconsistent. Then we have Fufov, who leans slightly more towards movement games, more specifically hole in the wall than anything else. And then we have Bear, who is also a bit more of an all-rounded player. Not super crazy at any game, but also not super weak. I think this team is going to be really interesting, and really depends on how well Draco does, as he has been a bit off lately in terms of performances. However, if he locks in, this team could very easily dominate, as I think they could easily solo PvP and do really good at hole in the wall. However, even then, I think they're still relatively decent at every game otherwise. although they might be a little bit weaker at RSR. And that is it for the TCC Reach for the Stars Teams Review. Now, I think it could be relatively anyone's games, besides maybe like a few teams, but otherwise, pretty balanced teams, and it's nice to see a lot of newcomers. However, don't forget, this is a charity event for the Sarcoma Foundation of America, and we're trying to raise $350 for this TCC. So, if you can, and you have like a little bit of money to spare, or if you don't, that's all right. As long as you like tune into the streams and all, it would mean like a lot to like everyone, and you'd be supporting like a great cause. So if you can or can't donate, like just do your best. As far as uploads will go, hopefully I'll get like some more like during like July, maybe one during June. I don't know. June's kind of like a weird month for me. But yeah, hopefully you'll see like more like streams though, at like the very least. So you've got that going for you. And with that, that is all, and bye bye.